Welcome. This is the video lecture on welfare economics. I'm Professor Cherry. This video lecture is the second part of a two-part set of video lectures on welfare economics. The first lecture introduced the concepts of consumer and producer surplus, which are measures of welfare. In this video lecture, we're going to take those measures and develop a bit further, but also apply them to some actual market analysis and policy analysis. So first we're going to go through the basics of welfare economics. Then we're going to look at total surplus. Before we looked at consumer and producer surplus, so we're going to introduce the concept of total surplus. And then we're going to look at the concept of market efficiency and how welfare economics and the measures of surplus informs us about market efficiency. And then we're going to look at some policy and market applications. So first, let's begin with restating what welfare economics is. It's the study of the level and distribution of the benefits generated by markets. And those benefits are measured or referred to as welfare. The level refers to the total benefits generated in the market. So what level of benefits does the market generate? And this introduces or returns us to the concept of efficiency, because if those benefits generated by the market are as large as possible, then the market is considered to be efficient. Then we have the distribution of those benefits. So this considers who receives the benefits generated by the market. Like, who are the winners and losers of a market condition? If a policy is introduced, who benefits from that policy and who loses welfare from that policy. And usually every policy has winners and losers. So welfare economics is a way to examine who wins and who loses from new policy or existing policy. So the difference between efficiency and fairness is important to keep in mind, because economics primarily focuses on efficiency, because that's an easier concept and more objective concept to measure. Fairness is a tricky concept, because if you ask 100 people what's fair, you might get 100 different answers. Now, that's not to say that fairness and distributional issues is not important. It's just that it's a little bit tricky to analyze because it is a subjective concept by nature. So when you look at efficiency, what we're talking about is the size of the benefits, or the size of the pie. And fairness refers to what are the relative sizes of the pieces of that pie, or who gets what share of that pie, or that share of welfare generated by the markets. So let's move to total surplus. Again, we looked at consumer surplus and producer surplus, and now we introduce the concept of total surplus, which is really easy because it's essentially the sum of the two previous measures we looked at. So it's the total benefits generated from the market. And that means it's the benefits received by the buyers and the sellers in the market. Total surplus is the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus. And how you measure total surplus is you take the value received by the buyer, and if you remember what that was willingness to pay, and you subtract out the cost of production, which we refer to as willingness to accept. So you could simply say total surplus is willingness to pay minus willingness to accept. And that gives you total surplus. You know, if you wanted to, on your own, look at a little simple math transformation, if you just added up consumer surplus and producer surplus, you would end up with this formula here. Total surplus equals willingness to pay minus willingness to accept. Another way to think about this intuitively is that it's just the value of the activity minus the cost of that activity. All right, so it's the profit generated by that transaction. Some of that profit is going to go to the buyer, which is the consumer surplus, and some of that profit is going to go to the seller, which is the producer surplus. So here we look at it graphically, and here we look at consumer surplus and producer surplus. Again, consumer surplus is between the demand curve and above the market price, that blue shaded area. The producer surplus is the area below the market price but above the supply curve, and that is represented by the red shaded area. Right, so the total surplus is, as I said before, consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So this represents, again, the benefits generated by the market as a whole, the total benefits. Redrawing this and just representing total surplus, it's that larger triangle. So it's below the demand curve but above the supply curve. And that green shaded area represents, as I said before, the total profit for society. Right? So the supply curve represents the cost of the activity. The demand curve represents the benefits or the value of that activity. And the difference, the value minus the cost, represents the benefits that society enjoys from this market activity. Now let's look at market efficiency. Now you remember, efficient means you're doing the best you can with what you have. Market efficiency simply means that it's generating the most welfare and the most benefits to society as possible. You can't do any better than this theoretical market generating the most benefits possible. And to understand how this works, we can consider the notion of price rationing. So prices help consumption be undertaken by the buyers with the highest value, willingness to pay, and the production is undertaken by the sellers with the lowest cost. And when you have that perfect price rationing, you can have an efficient outcome. So how does this work? Recall the demand curve, and all the spots on the demand curve represent different buyers. The higher end of the demand curve, above the price, are the buyers with the highest willingness to pay, meaning that they had the highest value for that activity or that good or service. And those are the individual consumers that are ending up purchasing that good or service. The buyers with the low values, the ones that do not value that good or service very much, with the low willingness to pay, is at the lower end of the demand curve, are going to be the ones that opt not to purchase it. So on the demand side, we can see that the buyers with the highest willingness to pay, or the highest value for that good or service, are the ones that end up purchasing and consuming it. The ones with the lowest value and willingness to pay are the ones that do not consume it. That's how price rationing works on the demand side. On the supply side, we can see that you have below the price, you remember the supply curve, along the points on the supply curve represent different sellers based on their cost of production. So below the price, you have producers that are low cost producers. And they are the ones producing the good or service. And then on the upper side of the supply curve, above the price, you have the high cost producers, and those are the ones that are not producing it. All right, so the price provides a cutoff point where only those buyers with values above the price consume it, and only those producers with the cost of production lower than the price are the ones producing it. So in a sense, the price rations consumption and production to the buyers who most value it and the producers that can produce it at the lowest cost. So that's how price rationing helps ensure that the markets are more efficient. This has to be followed up with some caveats, because this is a basic model, a basic framework that simplifies the reality quite a bit. In a perfectly competitive market, you might expect this to be the case, and markets can generate efficient outcomes. But for markets to be perfectly competitive and us to reach this efficient level of welfare, there are many strict conditions and assumptions that we must make about the markets. Right? So here are just a few. One, no market power can be held by either any buyers or sellers. One criteria that helps us reach this is that there are many buyers and many sellers. Another one would be complete and symmetric information among buyers and sellers, meaning that the buyer and the seller have the same information about that good or service. And you can just think about many goods and services out there, and for the most part, this condition is not met. We buy things all the time without knowing everything about that product. It's certainly not as much information about that product as a seller. Right? The classic example is when you get your car worked on by a mechanic. The mechanic knows a lot more about the workings and what's needed for that car to be repaired than the owner of the car. Right? So this, what we call asymmetric information, when one party has more information than the other party, that undermines markets being efficient. Then we have no barriers to entry. There has to be easy entry and exit within the markets. This complements the no market power condition. And as we mentioned before, prices need to reflect all relevant information, meaning there's no externalities, and we're going to talk about externalities in the next module, so you'll understand how prices sometimes don't reflect all information. And then we have price rationing. That must work. And we've covered some special cases where price rationing will not work. If you recall, where we have perfectly inelastic demand, for instance. If prices are unrelated to quantity demand, then price rationing is not going to work very well. And then you have to assume participants are rational. And we're going to talk about that in more detail in the next module as well. The truly perfectly competitive market, or the fully efficient market, doesn't really exist. And to the extent that the markets are inefficient, it's correlated to the extent these conditions that we just went through are not met. So the bigger the problems are with these conditions, the bigger the inefficiencies are going to be in the market. Now, this doesn't mean that markets are bad in general, because even when they're inefficient, oftentimes they provide more benefits and welfare for society than the alternative. Right? We talked about markets are a mechanism to allocate scarce resources. There are other mechanisms to allocate scarce resources, but markets generally outperform these alternative mechanisms. Now, this doesn't mean that markets should always be left alone, because in many markets, good policy can actually improve efficiencies and operations in those markets. For instance, in financial markets, regulations require full disclosure, and that's to mitigate the negative effects of the incomplete and asymmetric information that's inherent in those financial markets. And also, moving beyond efficiency, society might not like the outcomes that markets are providing, whether those markets are efficient or not. They might not like those outcomes because they don't think it's fair or just, so they might want to implement policies to address those concerns. Now, we spend a lot of time talking about efficiency, but this does not address distributional concerns. And distributional concerns is important. As I said before, efficiency measures the size of the pie, or how much welfare is generated by the markets. It does not address the issue of how those benefits and how that welfare is distributed among society. Welfare economics gives us some idea about the distribution of welfare. Consumer surplus and producer surplus tells us about the benefits that go to buyers and sellers. In particular, does the market benefit the consumers or the producers more in a market? And you can look at a particular policy or shock to a market and see, well, did that policy or shock to the market, did it help or hurt the consumers or producers more? And when you do policy analysis, welfare economics can be quite powerful because it can tell you who wins and who loses. Generally speaking, existing policy or new policy or the lack of policy, all of those alternative arrangements have different winners and losers. And it's important to assess those issues when looking at policy. So now let's look at some applications for welfare economics. First, let's look at elasticity. You remember elasticity is how responsive buyers and sellers are to price changes. And in this case, we're talking about price elasticity of demand and price elasticity of supply. elasticity tells us something about who is benefiting from the market more. And what we find is benefits from the market are relatively larger for the side of the market that's more inelastic. Now, looking at the three diagrams, you can see three different types of markets. And we're talking about a relative elasticity between supply and demand. So the side of the market that's more inelastic will receive more benefits from the market. For a good or service that has supply and demand, has similar elasticities, the welfare generated to the buyers and the sellers are similar. In a market where the demand is more inelastic or the supply is more elastic, consumers are going to receive more welfare. And then the third case, where you have demand being more elastic and supply being more inelastic, the seller is going to receive more benefits from that market. So now let's look at price ceiling. We're going to examine a policy that introduces a binding price ceiling into a market. Generally, what we see is that the binding price ceiling is going to provide benefits to the buyers, the ones that are able to buy. It reduces the benefits of the sellers while reducing the number of sellers, and it reduces total surplus. Let's look at this graphically. On the left-hand side, that's the market without the price ceiling. And that's what we've seen before, where you have an efficient level of welfare generated. And in this case, the elasticities are similar in the supply side and the demand side of the market, so the consumer and producer surpluses are of similar levels. Right? On the right-hand side, we have the introduction of the binding price ceiling. So it forces the price to be below the market price. And from what we learned before, we know a binding price ceiling is going to cause quantity supply to go down, quantity demand to go up, so you have excess demand. Right? But prices are going to be forced to be below market price. So consumer surplus is defined the same way. It's the area under the demand curve above the price. So in this case, it's the price ceiling. By having a lower price, we have generated greater benefits for those buyers able to purchase. There were some buyers that were able to buy before, but they're now pushed out of the market because now there's a shortage. Right? These buyers, of course, are worse off because they had surplus before, but now they have none. But the buyers that remain in the market, they're still purchasing. Now they purchase at a lower price, so they're really going to benefit. And whether consumer surplus as a whole is higher depends on whether this additional rectangle of benefits is larger than the lost triangle of consumer surplus. On the supply side of the market, it's going to be much clearer because producer surplus is unambiguously lower. Right? The price is lower for one thing, so all sellers are selling at a lower price, so that has reduced their producer surplus, but it's also pushed some of the producers out of the market. So you've lost a number of sellers, but you've also, the remaining sellers are receiving less surplus. So now let's look at taxes and use this welfare framework to look at the distributional impacts of taxes. Generally speaking, up front, we can say taxes lower consumer surplus in this market, it lowers producer surplus in this market, and it provides a transfer of welfare to another market. It's going to lower your total surplus in the market. To the extent that it lowers welfare, that is what we often refer to as a deadweight loss from a tax. So you impose a tax and it's going to lower total surplus. So on the left-hand side, we see a market without a tax. And in this case, we see that the demand is relatively more inelastic than supply. So we start out in a case where consumer surplus is a bit larger than producer surplus. All right, so now we're going to impose a tax. So first off, we see that the distribution of the tax burden, which we've talked about before, is disproportionately placed onto the buyer. And that is because the demand curve is relatively inelastic. But now looking at the welfare and the transfer, which is represented by this gray shaded area, that shows you that 2/3 to 3/4 of that transfer is paid for by the buyer, and the remaining part is paid for by the seller. So we see all of these results we just went through before. The consumer surplus is lower because some of those benefits now are being transferred away. Producer surplus is lower because they're receiving a lower price, and they are covering some of that transfer that's gone away. Now the clear triangle represents the deadweight loss. That triangle part of the diagram is no longer welfare because the activity stops at Q superscript T. So there's no activity beyond there. So now the buyers and sellers beyond Q superscript T are no longer in the market. There's no activity, so there's no welfare at all in that little triangle. All right, so this deadweight loss from a tax is the source of much of the rhetoric we hear about taxes and their negative impact on markets. Now this clearly shows that taxes negatively affect the market, that particular market in which you are taxing. That's not a question, but that's only part of the story because that transfer is going towards some other activity. And there are some activities that would generate returns greater than what you lose in that deadweight loss, right? So if that transfer is going towards research and development, or if it's going towards education, if it's going towards something that's investment, and that investment has a positive return, there are many things that would dominate that deadweight loss. So you would be better off, society would be better off with the tax and that investment than without the tax and without the investment. Now there's also many things that's not a good investment. It might be going towards a wasteful program that has no returns for society. And of course that would be a case where the society would be better off without the tax and without the program. So what this gets at is the reality of the situation is much more complex than taxes are bad, taxes are good. Taxes are not necessarily inefficient in the broader sense. They're inefficient in a particular market, but across markets they're not necessarily inefficient. And what we're going to learn later is that there are some taxes that are actually efficient and actually can be used to correct market failures. So now let's combine taxes and elasticity. So on the left-hand side, we see a case where taxes were imposed in a market where you have elastic supply or inelastic demand. And in this case, you have consumer surplus is reduced to a greater extent than producer surplus. Or in other words, the buyers are paying for a larger proportion of that tax revenue or that transfer than the sellers are paying for. Now on the right hand side we have a case where the market has elastic demand or inelastic supply, relatively speaking. And in this case you see that consumer surplus is relatively small to begin with compared to producer surplus, but further, with the burden of the tax, it falls mostly on the sellers relative to the buyers. Right? So this reiterates some of the issues that we talked about before, but now we see it in terms of surplus and how it affects the benefits that buyers receive from the market, the benefits that producers receive from the market, and also who pays for the transfer. So now let's look at a market shock. So these are things that we went through before about changes in equilibrium. So let's suppose something happens that led to an increase in supply. So the supply curve shifts to the right from S1 to S2, and we see that causes a price to be lower and quantity to be higher. And we can clearly see that consumer surplus is greater. Producer surplus, on the other hand, it's a little less clear because they're receiving a lower price, which is has a negative impact on producer surplus, but they have lower cost, which is a positive impact on producer surplus, and there's also more producers. So that's a little less clear, and you would have to weigh and actually get down to the numbers to figure out the net effect on producer surplus. Alright, that concludes this video lecture. Don't forget to read the text, review your notes, and take advantage of reviewing this video lecture for any material that you would like to see again.